Hey, what's up, gamers? Let me lower the. Actually, we can keep it there and just lower this. Okay. Um, what's up, gamers? What's up, guys, if you're not gaming, or women if you're not gaming at all? Okay. You might have seen oxytocin here. That means we're on Perry et al. I remember I thought this one was pretty cringe when I read it last time. It's not bad, actually. I quite like it, so it's okay. Anyway, Perry et al. Personal space. Let's just go over it real quick and then look at the brief. Is there anything important to look at here? We should understand what oxytocin is. Oxytocin is a social hormone that acts as a neurotransmitter. The hormone oxytocin plays a role in social bonding, childbirth, and breastfeeding, and has been seen to promote pro-social and approach behaviors. However, research has also shown that in some contexts, oxytocin can actually lead to envy, risk aversion, and feelings of hostility towards strangers. So on, so on, so on. This key study focuses on the role of oxytocin and how it affects people's preferences for interpersonal distance, which is personal space, depending on whether they are high or low in the trait of empathy. Empathy is a trait which plays an important role. Empathy refers to a person's ability to understand the thoughts, feelings, and experiences of another, and comprises to yeah, okay. So we understand now the ideas. Look over it real quick. We have an aim, research methodology. We have a design and variables, two different experiments, little table. We have our sample, procedure, oxytocin administration, and empathy assessment. Then we have our experiment 1, CID, experiment 2, choosing rooms, experiment the results for the experiment 1, CID, and the results for the experiment 2, choosing rooms, and the conclusion. And then eval, of course. Everybody's favorite evaluation. The brief. Perry et al. Predicted that people who are highly empathetic would be more likely to prefer closer interpersonal distances following administration of oxytocin versus a placebo, a white saline solution, while oxytocin would cause those with low empathetic traits to prefer greater interpersonal distances. They wanted to test this theory experimentally in a laboratory setting, which would have high levels of control and produce quantitative data that they could statistically analyze. Very nice. All right, the aim. Here we go, the aim. To investigate how oxytocin affects preferred interpersonal distance for high/low empathy trial scoring participants. All right, the research methodology. Half the participants are in experiment 1 and half the participants are in experiment 2. Huh? I wrote this like an hour ago, and then I had dinner, and then I finished the rest of it, so 1 second. Oh. Don't look at that. Don't look at me uploading videos. What's up with that? Bro, here you go. What am I clicking on? I'm supposed to look at this. I'm like brain dead. Ah. So, first is what's meant to be written here. Because this was repeated measures for the first IV that's actually being changed between people, not the naturally occurring one. So, half the participants did the experiment 1 first. Or sorry, yeah, there's 2 different experiments. I'm just retarded. But they both did, but they ended up doing both. Half the participants did experiment 1 first, half of them did experiment 2 first. It's in a laboratory setting. And there were repeated measures for the first independent variable and independent measures for the second independent variable. We'll go over those now. The design and variables. The first independent variable was the participants getting nasal drops. They were either oxytocin or placebo. This was repeated measures to avoid order effects via randomized. They avoided order effects via randomized order, and also avoided researcher bias and demand characteristics via a double-blind procedure. If you don't know what that means, double-blind procedure means that both the researcher and participant were completely unaware of which in this case placebo or oxytocin. They're completely unaware of if they were getting the placebo or the oxytocin, so even the researcher didn't know. What the fuck is that? Steam friend request, bro. What the fuck? Anyhow, if I knew who that was, I would tell you, but I don't. Anyways, independent variable 2, high versus low empathy. Operationalized via an IRI questionnaire. It stands for something, I don't know, it doesn't matter. It was operationalized via the IRI questionnaire. Operationalized means like basically making something be able to be measured, I think is the idea. So they operationalized it via the IRI questionnaire. Greater than or equal to 40 was high, and less than or equal to 33 was low. This was independent measures, of course, because it's a naturally occurring one. Naturally occurring variable, or independent variable. Okay, so the dependent variable is preferred interpersonal distance, as we talked about before. The personal space that you want, that you prefer, we're going to call it PID from now on. And it was measured via 2 different experiments. Experiment 1 measured PID via computer animation. It measured preferred interpersonal distance via computer animation. There was a repeated measures independent variable in this, in the computer animation. So there was a repeated measures independent variable of preferred interpersonal difference from different things, different protagonists, they call it in the study. You'll understand more, but basically a stranger, authority figure, friend, ball. It'll come back to it in a second. And in experiment 2, we had a computer-based task again called choosing rooms. It calculated values for 2 different dependent variables, the mean average preferred distance and the mean average preferred angle. The participants were told it was to help plan a room layout where they'd need to have a personal conversation with another participant in. And they compared preferences for spatial arrangement of the chairs, and it included a table implant as a control as well. That'll also make more sense in a second. But what? It'll make more sense in a second. Sample: 56 male undergrads, 19 to 32 years old. They received course credit or payment. They had no psychological conditions or brain conditions and no eyesight conditions. Pretty simple. Procedure: oxytocin administration. The participants got it twice, a week apart, same timing both times. They were randomly given either oxytocin or saline solution the first time, and then given the alternative or the opposite the next visit. And of course, it was double-blind, as said before. Empathy assessment. So for the empathy assessment, they just completed the IRI, as I said before. They then waited 45 minutes alone in a quiet room, which allowed the oxytocin levels to stabilize before the 2 experiments that they would then take. Experiment 1 is the CID paradigm one, the computer animation that measures preferred interpersonal distance. It showed them a word for the thing/protagonist that they would then, measure the distance from. It showed them that word for 1 second, and then the participant would stare at a fixation point for 0.5 seconds in between every single different question, and then it would show them a circular room with 8 doors. The protagonist is in the middle. The participant is in the middle, and the protagonist enters from a door and moves toward the participant, which is in the center. And then the participant is then able to press the space bar to stop the protagonist whenever they want, whenever they feel like they're close enough to measure their preferred interpersonal distance. There are 4 different protagonists, and they would appear 3 times each from different doors. The PID, the preferred interpersonal distance, is scored as a percentage of the distance left between the participant and protagonist. And for example, 0% is me and your mom's proximity from each other, and 100% would be you and the opposite sex's proximity from each other. Moving along. Basically, 0% is very close, and 100% is very far, if you can understand that. Experiment 2. Sorry. I don't know. Maybe I was angry when I wrote this. It's fine. I was a little bit of a goofy guy when I wrote this. Okay, experiment 2. They were told that they would have a meeting with another participant about personal topics. The room would be laid out according to their preferences. It was not true. Obviously, they're just saying that to make the person care and to make the person choose answers based on what they would prefer. So the computer program showed pairs of rooms with different distances and angles between the furniture, between the chairs, the table, the plant. The picture would be the rooms would be shown for 2 seconds, and then in between each pair they'd have to fixate on a point on the blank screen for 0.5 seconds, and every time the participant would have to choose one of the rooms, one of the two rooms each time. Results: experiment 1. Oxytocin decreased the mean preferred distance from the protagonist in the high empathy group, but it increased it in the low empathy group. So this is something that we're going to see repeated a lot. Sorry, this is something that we're going to see repeated a lot. Yeah. The fact that oxytocin decreased the mean preferred distance from the protagonist in the high empathy group. So basically, like for the high empathy group, taking oxytocin decreased the preferred interpersonal distance, but in the low empathy group, having oxytocin increased the preferred interpersonal distance. But overall, both differences were quite small, only 3 to 4%, but still something to be looked at. Then in the high empathy placebo group, when they had the placebo, there was big differences between preferred interpersonal distance for friend versus authority and friend versus stranger. However, that was not seen for the ball. It was similar for the ball. But that was until oxytocin was given, and then it would be then their preferred interpersonal distance would be significantly closer to the ball when they had the oxytocin. In experiment 2, the high empathy group had closer chair distances on oxytocin versus placebo. This was the opposite effect in the low empathy group. The low empathy group, when they were on oxytocin, were further away chair distances than when they were on placebo. The effect of oxytocin on chair distance was only significant for the high empathy group, though. Not very significant for the low empathy group. Empathy group. I keep saying empathy. I don't know. Finally, oxytocin had no effect on preferred chair angle for either empathy group. That was one of the independent variables for the second experiment, but for the choosing rooms experiment, but it wasn't significant change at all. Conclusion: oxytocin affects PID depending on empathy levels. High empathy equals closer PID on oxytocin, and low empathy equals further PID on oxytocin. This is closer or further than normal, right? Than not being on oxytocin. Oxytocin maybe only increases PID in high empathy people when the interaction is not self-threatening. You get this finding because the oxytocin effects were more pronounced for a ball versus a stranger or authority. So basically, when it was just a ball, they would be way closer versus stranger or authority. Or a stranger. Okay, evaluation. Ethics. Okay. Ethics. Not very weak, but weak in the way that they deceived the people. There's deception. They were told that they'd be choosing a room for a meeting where they'd discuss a personal topic. Of course, it wasn't true, and it may have caused stress since they didn't know what personal topic it was or who they were gonna, discuss with, and so that risks psychological harm. Then we go on to methodological issues. Strength, reliability, standardization. There's a high level of standardization. The computer can control everything perfectly: timing, visuals, speeds. The procedure can be replicated easily to verify the reliability of the findings. Very nice. Another strength, validity. The validated paradigm, the CID paradigm that was used to measure / test preferred interpersonal distance, was very valid. Previous testing shows that it is a valid measure of PID, and this increases the validity of findings, of course. Another strength, validity. The double blind. The administration of the placebo / oxytocin, oxytocin, was double blind. I already explained it before, but if you forgot, double blind means that both the participant and researcher were unaware of which which type of independent variable the person was taking, or like which side of it basically. Right, like it could be anything. In like a taste test, it could be, if they're blindfolded, the researcher is giving it to them and measuring their reaction, then it would be best if it was double blind and the researcher didn't see whether or not it was, an apple or a pear that the person ate, and the participant also wouldn't see either with a blindfold on. That's the sort of idea. And so in this case, the participant didn't know if they were given the placebo or the oxytocin, and it was the exact same for the researcher. They also didn't know. This avoids demand characteristics and researcher bias that would otherwise maybe be there based on the expectations of oxytocin presence or absence. Then a weakness for validity is that they use self-reports. The empathy levels were measured via self-reports. Desirability bias comes into play here. There may have well been a preference to be high empathy, and so people may have chosen those sort of answers rather than chosen what they really truly felt, and that would cause the low empathy participants to end up in the high empathy group, and that reduces the validity of the findings for the high empathy group. And then if we move on to Abaja Sabaja, strength. Quantitative data is objective. No subjective interpretation is needed. For example, the percentage distance that was measured in the first experiment by the computer allows for the objective comparison of scores and increases the validity of results. If you're ever given a question about objectivity versus subjectivity or quantitative versus qualitative data, that's always the idea, is it's quantitative versus qualitative data. Or if they're asking you about quantitative data versus qualitative data is objective and valid and allows for objective comparison of scores, blah blah blah. No subjective interpretation needed. No researcher bias. Of course, qualitative data doesn't have all of that, but it gives further detail and explanation into why things are happening, especially with humans. You can get their explanations, and that can be really valuable. So those are the two different sides of the coin, basically. Okay, penultimate section, kind of. Generalizations, weakness. Generalizing beyond the sample is weak. They only used male participants. Previous research has actually shown that males and females respond differently to oxytocin, and so you can't generalize these findings to females. Simple. Another weakness, generalizing to everyday life. They used computer tasks in a laboratory setting, and that doesn't provoke the same emotions as like, being in real life and having a stranger walk up to you in real life. You'd probably, you might stop them sooner, you might stop them later, I don't know, right? But that lacks ecological validity, and it doesn't reflect, wow, I don't know how to spell. I'm not even gonna fix it, I'm just such a rebel. It doesn't reflect real life. It doesn't reflect real life, and it therefore it cannot be generalized to real life experiences or situations. Speaking of situations, issues and debates, individual versus situational. Individual differences appear to change oxytocin effects on preferred interpersonal distance. Decreased preferred interpersonal difference for high empathy and increased for low empathy, as we talked about before in the results and the conclusions and stuff, right? So those are individual differences, clearly, right? And so that supports individual explanation. However, oxytocin changed behavior based on the situation as well, like the protagonist type, right? Like you would let a stranger get maybe medium range with you, but you let a friend or a ball get into melee range. Sorry for the gamer speak, but you know what I mean. And other research also shows that situation affects oxytocin levels, like temperature and like physical touch with other people. And so preferred interpersonal distance could be affected by situational factors, and that supports the situational explanation. Finally, application in everyday life. It could be used for improving social behavior. Previous research has suggested that oxytocin can help those with social deficits, like, for example, autism. However, these findings obviously suggest otherwise, where people with low empathy on oxytocin actually increased preferred interpersonal distance, right? And that's, creating a deficit in somebody's social behavior in a way, right? If you can't even walk up to somebody and talk to them. So oxytocin may not be a suitable treatment, and more research needs to be done to verify the effects. There you go. That was Perry et al. Personal space. Thank you for listening, everybody. Peace out.